Okay, so welcome to a series, hopefully a series on Ein Yaakov. So, we'll try to do, like a half hour like last year, roughly a half hour each time. Just a little bit about the motivation and who Ein Yaakov was before we actually talk about the shir itself, right? So the Ein Yaakov is a compilation of all of the non-halachic sections of the Talmud Bavli and a little bit of the Yerushalmi. It was compiled by Rabbi Yaakov ibn Habib, I think, in the 1500s. He went through all of Shas and he took anything out that he felt was agadic in nature. And then there's been a lot of commentaries that have been written on the Ein Yaakov since then. He himself didn't finish it. His son, Levi ibn Habib, actually finished it because he died before he managed to finish his work. So his son finished it for him. And so we'll be learning the Ein Yaakov, which again is just the Gemara. So it has Rashi and it has other commentaries. One of the more famous ones is the Maharsha, which I personally actually connect to less, or I find a little bit more challenging. So we'll learn Rashi just to understand what the sugya is saying, but then the Perushim that I like, there's one called the Iyun Yaakov, which is written by someone named Yaakov ben Yosef Reischer, who was an Austrian rabbi. He lived at the turn of the 18th century, in the early 1700s. And he brings midrashim from random places and has these, hopefully we'll see, these kind of insights or layers of reading onto the Agadata that are kind of interesting. And then also we'll maybe look at the Anaf Yosef when it's relevant, which was written, I think, in the 1800s. It's a later Perush. The idea is just to kind of go through the things that I find are more interesting. We'll just learn those sugyot, kind of these singular ideas each week, starting with Masachet Yevamot, because you have brachot and then moed and then nashim. So I've from the little I know, Masachet, the Seder Nashim has a really interesting agada to it. It's some of the more interesting ones. So I figure we'll start with that, and then Yevamot is a good place to start. So with that framing for this year, want to talk about the first one that I want to look at, which is we actually going to be more halachic than what we'll hopefully do, but it's a Agadata that's based on this Mishnah. So we have to learn the Mishnah a little bit, which is going to be halachic, but then we'll see an interesting Agadata at the end of it. So the context here is the world of Yevamot obviously is around the Yibum and Chalitza, and there's a lot of very detailed family trees and complicated relationships. So the background that we need to know for this is that basically, the halacha of Yibum is if a man dies without children, so then his wife is then supposed to marry that man's brother. So that's called Yibum if she ends up marrying the brother, or she can do Chalitza, which is the ceremony where she doesn't marry him and instead she is freed from him, but she is in some sense tied to the brother of her deceased husband. That is obviously normally a forbidden relationship, right? Eshet Ach is explicitly forbidden in Vayikra along with a lot of other Arayot. So normally a woman would not be allowed to be with her husband's brother, but Yibum is an exception where not only is Arayot permitted, but it's actually required. That becomes important because we talk about the Mishnah talks about this concept that when it comes to Yibum, it does trump Eshet Ach, or it kind of nullifies Eshet Ach, but it doesn't nullify other Arayot. All the other Arayot are still in place. So what does that mean? So let's say you take an example of a man, let's say Chaim. Okay, so Chaim is married gets married to Simon's daughter. Okay, and then actually, let me think about this for a second. What's the case? Chaim gets married to Simon's daughter, right? And then Chaim passes away. Let me remember the case. 1 second. It's complicated. I'm already forgetting it, right? So, sorry. Let's say Chaim and Simon are brothers, right? If Chaim and Simon are brothers, And then Chaim marries Simon's daughter, right? In other words, let's say you guys are brothers, and then Simon, you have a daughter, and then Chaim marries his niece, right? So then Chaim dies without children, right? So Simon now has the obligation of Yibum, right? He has to go and marry the deceased, the wife, but it's his daughter. So even though Yibum trumps the requirement, the Isser of Eshet Ach, it doesn't trump any other araya. So what that means is, if you have, I'm going to get rid of Chaim and Simon, it's too confusing for me. If you have Reuven and Shimon are brothers, and Reuven is married to Shimon's daughter, and Reuven dies, so Shimon does not marry, is exempt from the obligation of Yibum, because she is an erva to him because she's his daughter. And that's true for any erva. So if the relationship between the deceased brother's wife and the person who's required to do Yibum is one of erva, then there's no din of Yibum. There's an exemption. And everybody agrees to that there's no machloket there. The question is, what if instead of the daughter, there is what's called a tzara. A tzara is a co-wife or a second wife, right? We're talking in a situation where you can have a polygamous marriage. So a man is married to more than one person. So let's say Reuven is married to two people, right? One of them is Shimon's daughter, and one of them is somebody else. Okay? So obviously, if Reuven dies, so Shimon can't do Yibum with the daughter, right? Because with his own daughter, because that's a rayot. But is Shimon required to do Yibum with his daughter's co-wife, who is also Reuven's wife, if that makes sense? So she's called the Tzarat Erva, right? She is the co-wife of someone who is forbidden via Erva. So the one who's forbidden via Erva, everybody agrees is forbidden, but the co-wife is a question: is she forbidden or is she not forbidden? And so that's actually a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And that's the starting point of our Mishnah. So the Mishnah reads as follows and says, Beit Shammai matirin hatzarot le'achim, uVeit Hillel osrim. So this is one of those rare cases where actually Beit Hillel is machmir and Beit Shammai is mekel. Right? We know usually it's the other way around. But actually, as we'll see, that's not even the case here. And actually Beit Hillel is mekel in a certain sense. But to kind of re-emphasize the situation, because again, it's confusing with the family trees, Reuven is married to Shimon's daughter and to someone else. So we'll say Reuven is married to Shimon's daughter Leah and to Rachel. Reuven dies without children. Shimon would normally have to do Yibum with Leah, but he can't because Leah is his daughter, and so Yibum doesn't apply there. The question is, does Yibum apply to Rachel, who is also Reuven's wife? Beit Shammai would say yes, it's mutar, and actually it's required because it's Yibum. So Shimon would have to do Yibum with Rachel or Chalitza. But Beit Hillel would say once one co-wife is an erva, all the co-wives are exempt from Yibum. It doesn't matter how many wives Reuven have. Reuven can have 1,000 wives. If even one of those 1,000 wives is related to Shimon in some way that would make that relationship forbidden, all of the wives are p'turot from doing Yibum with that husband. That's Beit Hillel's position. So you can see now that this can cause questions, right? So the Mishnah continues and says, Chaltzu, Beit Shammai poslin min hakahuna, uBeit Hillel machshirin. So what does that mean, Beit Shammai poslin min hakahuna, Beit Hillel machshirin? So I have here the Gemara inside. So Chaltzu, which means atzarot min ha'achin, Beit Shammai poslin min hakahuna, shechilitzata chilitza. In other words, if Shimon does chalitza with Rachel, right, not his daughter but his daughter's co-wife, so he doesn't do Yibum but he does chalitza. According to Beit Shammai, that chalitza is valid, right? It's a fine chalitza because he had to do chalitza or Yibum, and so a Kohen is not allowed to marry a chalutza, right? A Kohen is not allowed to marry a grusha or a chalutza. So if then Shimon dies, right, and now Rachel, which is the co-wife, is widowed, she, according to Beit Shammai, is not allowed to go marry a Kohen because she is a chalutza. She was supposed to be miyabemet to Shimon, but then she died. But then Shimon did chalitza and died, and now she's a surah to a Kohen because she's a chalutza. So that's what Beit Shammai postlin min hakahuna. Beit Hillel machshirin. Why are Beit Hillel machshirin? Because according to Beit Hillel, there's no Yibum or Chalitza in this scenario, right? Because the co-wife is an Erva, so Rachel is also Ptura from Yibum Chalitza. So if Shimon wants to do Chalitza with Rachel, that's very nice. It has no significance whatsoever. And so if Shimon then goes and dies, it's as though nothing happened. And so Rachel can go and marry a Kohen because she never had any relationship with Shimon, the brother of her previously deceased husband, Reuven. So that makes sense. What about if they do Yibum, right? What about if Shimon does marry Rachel? So Beit Shammai machshirin, u Beit Hillel poslin. So now it's the opposite. Beit Shammai say, okay, if they did Yibum, and now Shimon dies, right? So now she's a widow. She's an almanah. Because she was married through Yibum to Shimon, and he died. And Kohanim are allowed to marry widows. There's no problem. So machshirin, Rachel is now allowed to go marry Kohen. Beit Hillel poslin. Beit Hillel say that's no good. Why? Because if they do Yibum, that Yibum is invalid, right? Because Shimon is actually, there's no Yibum, according to Beit Hillel, between Shimon and Rachel, because Rachel's co-wife Leah is his daughter. So there's Erva there, all the wives are Pturot from Yibum. So if they do Yibum, it's not valid, and it's actually, it's a znut. It's not a valid relationship between them. And so then if Shimon dies, she's a surah to a Kohen, because a Kohen is not allowed to marry a zonah, or someone who's been in a relationship that wasn't a holy relationship. So this leads to issues. And what the real problem here is, this is actually very problematic, because if they have a child, what is the status of that child now? If Shimon and Rachel have a child, they did Yibum, but according to Beit Hillel, that Yibum was totally, there's no significance to that Yibum, and they're living biznut. So if they have a child, that child is now a mamzer, right? But according to Beit Shammai, it's kosher because it's Eshet Ach is trumped by the Yibum. In other words, for Beit Hillel, she is violating Eshet Ach by being with Shimon, and so their child is a mamzer because it's arayot. But according to Beit Shammai, because it's actually a valid Yibum, it's not arayot, and the child is not a mamzer. So the question is the offspring of this relationship a mamzer or not? So that's the halachic framework, okay? And now the question is, great, so what do you do? In other words, let's say Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, right, you have two schools of thought, and this is a scenario where they disagree, and one school of thought would say that's a kosher marriage, another school of thought would say that's not a kosher marriage, and the child is a mamzer. How do you relate to each other in terms of that scenario? And so the Mishnah says as follows. And the Mishnah obviously doesn't normally digress from halacha and go into something that's more agadic. So this is kind of an unusual scenario. But the Mishnah says as follows. As we just saw, even though each one does the opposite of the other one, depending on whether they did Yibum or Chalitza, Lo nimnu Beit Shammai milisa nashim mi Beit Hillel, velo Beit Hillel mi Beit Shammai. They didn't not intermarry with each other. They didn't prevent each other from marrying each other's daughters and sons. Why would that be a problem? Why would you think that would be something that would be an issue? So again, if we go back to Rashi quickly, so Rashi would say, Afal pi lo nimneu. So Afal pi shebnei hatzara shenit yamdu kebeit Shammai mamzerim, as we just explained, hand of Beit Hillel. So for Beit Shammai, the kosher children would be mamzerim according to Beit Hillel, right? And mamzerim are never allowed to marry into the Jewish into anybody, right? So sherei be'isur eshet ach hi alehem, because that relationship was a relationship eshet ach, and it wasn't permitted through Yibum. Eshet ach bekaret uvnei arayot shehen chayve kretud mamzerim hen, right? Because it's a rayot and it's karet, and so it's mamzerim. Kedamrinam bepirkin afilu hachi lo nimneu Beit Hillel milisa nashim mi Beit Shammai. But even so, Beit Hillel still married Beit Shammai's children. Well, what about the fear that they permit mamzerim? That Beit Shammai would say to Beit Hillel, these specific people are the offspring of that type of relationship, which we say is kosher. And so uporshim, Beit Hillel simply wouldn't do those shidduchim. Whereas Beit Hillel would do the 99% of shidduchim that are fine. And then those scenarios where Beit Hillel thought they were mamzer and Beit Shammai thought they were totally fine, so Beit Hillel simply wouldn't have their children marry those offspring. That's Rashi's explanation. So that's what the Mishnah says, and then the Mishnah continues and says, "Kol ha'tarot v'atmeot shayu elu mitarim ve'elu mitamim lo nimnu osin tarot elu al gabe elu." And then similarly, when it comes to tuma and tara, so anything that Beit Shammai would say is tama and Hillel would say is tar, and Beit Hillel would say is tama and Beit Shammai would say is tahor. So they disagreed halachically, but they would still. They wouldn't let that get in the way of them being able to use each other's kelim. In other words, they would still work in such a way that they would except for the things that they held were usher, but the other one held were mutter, they would still use everything else that they both agreed on. Similar to the situation with the marriages. So that's what the Mishnah says. The Breita that the Gemara brings continues and actually elaborates a little bit and says, Lo nimnu Beit Shammai milisa nashim mi Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel mi Beit Shammai. So they didn't not intermarry with each other. Why? Lelmdcha, to teach you, Shchiva ורעות נוהגים זה בזה, לקיים מה שנאמר, האמת והשלום אהבו. Because they wanted to teach this concept that they practiced love and friendship with one another to fulfill the pasuk of Haemet ve'Shalom ehavu. Now, what's going on here is that you have here this tension between halacha and what we could argue is meta halacha, right? That on the one hand you have the need to stick to halachic principles, right? You have a situation where Beit Hillel hold a certain thing is forbidden and very seriously forbidden. Mamzer is very, very significant. And Beit Shammai say it's okay. And so on the one hand you have to maintain your halachic principles, but on the other hand, the meta-halachic ramifications of sticking to those principles would be extremely dire. Because if you said, we don't want to risk any possibility of having to deal with what we think are mamzerim, Beit Hillel would then have to say that we can't marry anyone from Beit Shammai. Because Beit Shammai say that these relationships are fine. And so they will not relate to them as mamzerim, and then we'll end up we think they're mamzerim, we don't want to marry in with those people. And so you have this tension between needing to hold on to the halacha, but also on the other hand, like maintaining kind of this larger sense of making sure that we don't split up into agudot, like into groups, and that there's a unified, right? That there's no division based on that. And so the emphasis of this mission, the Beit is to say that Beit Hillel trusted Beit Shammai to say this specific relationship is something that's forbidden, and then they simply wouldn't do those shidduchim. But overall, Beit Hillel made sure that ahava and chiba and re'ut were practiced between them, and that they dafka made sure to marry it with each other, even though there were scenarios that could potentially be really problematic halachically. So I want to look at what the Iyun Yaakov says, right, which is this commentary. So Safari doesn't have the Iyun Yaakov, so I only have it here in like a hard copy. So I'll read it in the Hebrew, but I wrote it here in the English. But basically the Iyun Yaakov says as follows. So he comments on this Gemara and he says, V'zeh lashon ha'ra'avad, b'perush ha'mishnah perek daled eduyot mishnah. Okay, so the Ravid, right, he wrote a perush ha'mishnah, and so the Iyun Yaakov says this is what his language was. So he said as follows: V'lo nimnu elu me'elu, lefi shelo yu choshdin elu le'elu. So Beit Hillel didn't say we're not going to marry the Beit Shammai because they didn't suspect them of any ill intent, right? They trusted them, right? Sheit'u otam b'davar shu asur, shamru lahem shu mutar, ad kan lashono, right? That Beit Hillel didn't think Beit Shammai, would, because they wanted a shidduch so badly, they would be willing to lie or trick Beit Hillel and say it's fine, because Beit Shammai held it was fine, even though they knew that Beit Hillel thought it was a mamzer. That Beit Hillel trusted Beit Shammai to be aware and sensitive to Beit Hillel's chumrah in this situation, or Beit Hillel's psak in this situation, and that was why they felt comfortable marrying into them in general, because they knew that Beit Shammai wouldn't try to deceive them just to get a shidduch to happen, and they thinking that it was okay, and so they felt comfortable deceiving them. And so then the Iyun Yaakov continues and says, "V'nira li shezeh shemedakdek lomar b'lashon ahava v're'ut." So the fact that the Breita used the language of re'ut and ahava, which is love, al da'at de'amrinan ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, ma desani lach l'chavercha lo ta'aved. So we all know the famous story of the man who comes to Hillel the original Hillel, and says to him, I'll convert to Judaism if you teach me the whole Torah on one foot. And so Hillel says, that which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. Right? Right? Everything else is the commentary. And so a lot of people ask, why did Hillel negate ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha into a negative? But what the Iyun Yaakov here is saying is that the principle behind ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, which is Hillel's principle, right, is this idea of that which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. And so the Iyun Yaakov says as follows. So how do we apply that here? Ukashem shelo nicha le'adam liten lo davar asur mida'ato ve'emru lo shehu mutar. So just like a person would never want someone to tell him something which is forbidden to him that it's permitted to him, right? A person would never want to be tricked and told that something which he thinks be told that something is okay, which is actually not okay for him. A person would not want to be deceived like that. So therefore, right, that's the idea behind like the golden rule of don't do unto others what you don't want done to you. So people will not do that to other people, right? So the Iyun Yaakov says, "Kach lo avdu zeh lezeh, lefi she'avav rayut na'agu zeh bazeh." Kedichtiv ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. In other words, the Iyun Yaakov is saying the Ravid said that the Beit Hillel trusted Beit Shammai, and Beit Shammai trusted Beit Hillel. Why do they trust each other? So he says because this principle of avan rayut is based on Hillel's interpretation of it, which is that which is hateful unto you, don't do to someone else. And so, in this situation, Beit Hillel trusts Beit Shammai to say, Beit Shammai wouldn't want us to tell them something is mutter, which they hold as usher. So we trust them not to tell us that these people are okay if they're really mamzerim. And so that is the fulfillment of ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, right? According to Hillel. So it's Hillel l'shitato. In other words, Beit Hillel is trusting Beit Shammai with ahava and re'ut based on Hillel's interpretation of what ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha means, which means don't do something hateful to someone else that you wouldn't want done to you. So the Iyun Yaakov is applying that famous concept of Hillel and the way he interprets ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha to this situation to shed more light on why Hillel trusted Shammai, even in a case of mamzerim, where normally we're going to be extremely, extremely careful, because the importance of ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha is so vast that it overrides the need to be so machmir that you put up a fence in every marriage in this scenario. So, just to kind of summarize here, right? Again, you have this tension between this concept of ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha and making sure that people trust each other and that there's good faith and that people are willing, that Jews are willing to love each other. But on the other hand, that you have this halachic system and that people need to follow the halacha. And so, how do you resolve that tension? So in this scenario, Hillel is saying is leading by example, as it were, and saying here we're actually machmir in a situation that is actually very, very stringent, but the importance of ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha is such that we want to make sure that we're setting an example, and we're still going to make sure to intermarry with Beit Shammai. And I think that's perhaps the elaboration here at the end of the Breita, where it says, right? You have this pasuk in Zechariah, this famous pasuk. It says that you have truth and peace, right? And those can come into conflict. Those ideals, those values, right? That sometimes you have peace, sometimes you have truth, and they're not necessarily always the same thing, right? Just like a quick tangent, you have like Moshe is always kind of the Moshe Emet, he's the man of truth, and then Aaron is the Ohev Shalom Rodef Shalom, and they're complementary. Because they each have their own strength, right? One is very strict in midat, the justice, and one is the peace. And then how do those two values interplay with each other in a halachic and in an agadic system? So here you have a case where there is a clear tension between them, but we see that Beit Hillel is leading by example and finding a way to in the scenarios where they really think it's a mamzer, make sure to separate. But other than that, to be very, very clear that we need to make sure that it's the importance of keeping good relationship between us and between Beit Shammai trumps the chumras of trying to say, maybe they're mamzer, we're gonna make sure not even to deal with that. So that's kind of the Iyun Yaakov on that idea. Ad kan. In general, like I tried to say in the beginning, it's normally going to be a lot more agadic, and hopefully we'll look at more mefarshim, but this one had a bit of an introduction that had to be halachic in nature, just to set the stage for what was ultimately a the idea that the Iyun Yaakov is pointing at. Questions, thoughts, or not?
Shkoyach.
All right.
Shkoyach.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Yeah. Bye.